are talking prototype X29A, which is also known as simply Prototype. This is a 1992 movie directed by Philip J. Roth. Now, the 90s, they were filled with cyborg movies on the success of Terminator and RoboCop. This one decided to do something a little bit different and is less of a cyborg action movie and more of a cyborg love story on the lines of Romeo and Juliet. So the world that we have here is a post-apocalyptic one, and we learn through some nice exposition that they love to do in the 90s in a bit of a, a text in the front. You know, there's been this war, etc., and the powers that be have created these cyborgs, which were known as Omegas, and they were meant to be the hope for mankind. However, sometime later, the powers that be decided that this wasn't the solution, and they wanted them wiped out. They created a second generation of cybernetic entities called the prototypes, which were meant to wipe these Omegas out. Now, this actually takes place 20 years after that, and we have a situation where it's kind of just desolate lands now, but there is one Omega left, and this is this young girl called Chandra, and she's living in this kind of like this post-apocalyptic kind of environment, and there's all sorts of kind of shady goings on. You know, it's not a nice place to live. Everyone's very violent, and you know, he's expecting these things. However, she has got one admirer in this guy who is in a wheelchair and is kind of bound to this he can't, you know, he's dependent on this wheelchair to survive, really. But she's not really interested. However, this guy, Hawkins, is offered a chance to be reborn with working legs. And this is in the kind of the form of this prototype, although he doesn't actually know this at this point, and he is offered this chance without reading or knowing too much about it, and ultimately gets reborn as a prototype, therefore having the instinct, so to speak, or the programming to destroy the Omega, which of course is this woman that he loves. So there you go, a kind of Romeo and Juliet in a low-budget 90s post-apocalyptic sci-fi movie. So let's talk about what works. So kudos for this movie for trying something a little bit different. There is so many of these sort of cyborg this, robo that in the 90s, and this one dared to be different. It dared to have something a little bit more, shall we call it, cerebral, or at least an attempt at something cerebral. Not really an action film. There are a couple of action sequences, one at the beginning and one right at the end, but they're relatively kind of small scale, nothing too kind of too exciting to kind of write home about. But you know, I've got to give it props for trying something a little bit different, because a lot of these movies, having reviewed quite a lot of them now, and obviously I was a big fan of them, to be fair, when I was of the age of VHS in the 90s, but they are quite samey. You know, it's kind of just lots of petrol explosions and prosthetics and kind of tough guys. So I will give this one props for having a different take on it, a different kind of feel to it. The way this is filmed as well is again, it feels a little different, a lot darker. This isn't kind of a plucky kind of action movie where there's good guys and bad guys. Everyone here is kind of super depressing. It reminded me a little bit of another post-apocalyptic movie, A Boy and His Dog, that starred Don Johnson. It's a grim place to live. When we have external shots that all have like an orange filter on it, so it's kind of like, it all looks like there's kind of a constant kind of atomic dust in the air, things like that. Everyone is kind of dirty. Everyone is kind of smoking all the time for some reason, although it's never really addressed. But, you know, it feels really dirty and grimy, like a Dust Devil kind of style scenario here. So it's very much a dark future, this one. The actual suit itself really stands out because it is kind of a shiny metallic suit in this kind of otherwise very kind of colour devoid backdrop, if you like. And you know, it kind of looks admittedly kind of cheesy, and it's got that sort of Batman 89 situation where he can't move his neck and stuff like that. But nonetheless, it's kind of cool looking, and it's like, you know, if you were to kind of rock up at Comic-Con wearing something like this, you know, people would be lining up to take photographs with you, something, you know, along the lines of that. You know, it's got metallic abs and all of that. To be honest with you, the design of the prototype seems somewhat at odds with the movie, because it's kind of quite cheesy looking, but whilst the movie is kind of very sobering other than that, if that makes sense. The movie also tries to have some vague religious meaning as well, where we have these kind of people that are protecting the Omega, and they seem to almost revere her as kind of like a godlike kind of being and stuff like that. So, you know, if you want something different, there is this. So there are some things I think that are, you know, you can say in the plus column about this film. However, I think the execution of this movie is quite poor in some aspects. One being the characterization. You get virtually no kind of characterization on our kind of our principal players. You have really no idea who they are. Because everything is so dark and kind of like colour devoid, it's really difficult to kind of know what characters are on screen at any one time in some sequences. And because they're so vague in their kind of characterization, again, everyone kind of blends into one. Hawkins, I know because he had a huge mullet, for example, is the best way I could kind of spot him. But it wasn't because he had any kind of distinguishing kind of personality outside of he was in love with Chandra, who's our kind of, you know, female version, you know, our female kind of heroine. There's a lot of kind of like secondary characters that are kind of in the background. You're thinking, I don't really know who you are or what your kind of deal is. I mean, we introduced to these kind of like these followers, there's these kind of other denizens, there's kind of like a bunch of kind of like, criminal types, and again everyone is so ill-defined here. There's a brother who seems a little bit too cozy with her, and I'm thinking, oh, I don't know what's kind of going on here. The characterization on this movie is quite poor. Now, as I've mentioned, there are only a couple of action sequences within this film, one right at the beginning and one pretty much right at the end. The remainder of the film is very slow moving, and with characters that you can't really kind of buy into, it makes it for quite a bit of a slog. And like I've said, visually it's quite, you know, bland in a way as well, outside of the prototype. But the prototype doesn't actually turn up until an hour into this movie. So it's kind of, it's dull to look at. You have kind of uninteresting and not well developed characters. Nothing really of note happens in the kind of this kind of movie as well. And it's punctuated by keep having these computer screens come up with kind of like a, you know, an early 90s sort of computer graphics and stuff like that that seem to just pop up and kind of show you stuff every so often. Not interesting. The acting is okay-ish for a B-movie film, but it's nothing to kind of write home about. The dialogue is, kind of, I say, is a little on the trite side, things like this. So this is kind of a strange movie in the fact that I think it has aspirations for being art house and kind of meaningful and stuff like that, but it just doesn't have the pedigree, the narrative flow, or the characterization to really pull it off. So it becomes a little bit of a, who is this movie made for? Because, you know, people who are into Cyborg, Cop and T-Force and things like this will be too slow and boring for them. But I don't think people who like art house cinema are going to be interested in probably this low-grade melodrama as they would probably see it. So it begs the question of what is the audience of this movie? And I don't think there is one, realistically, unless you kind of, or it's very small at the least. So this movie kind of is one of the oddities of the kind of the early 90s, early to mid 90s, and the kind of the cyborg fad that was kind of sweeping the video shelves back then. And I remember watching this one when it came out because the cover looks cool, you know, but it's just kind of dull at the end of the day. And I will give it some props for trying to do something a little different, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good because of it, if that makes sense. So a strange experiment, certainly one to look out for if you are bored of the kind of the typical kind of action movies of the 90s, and if you go into it knowing that it's more of a dramatic piece, more of a love story to a point, although the female is never really interested in the kind of like the guy, so it's never really a Romeo and Juliet scenario. It's kind of more of like he's just interested in her and she's like, whatever. But anyway, it's just kind of an odd little movie that kind of stuck out, and is, I suppose, more interesting to watch now than when I watched it when I was, in my early 20s and stuff. So I'll give it a 4 out of 10. It is not an interesting film, if I'm honest, but it's not terrible if you are prepared to watch this type of movie. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.